Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over two incredibly creepy and confusing cases of someone's tragic end. But even more than that, the second story has one of the most cruel and disturbing elements to it that you can possibly imagine. So, as always, viewer discretion is advised. Before we get into the video, I want to introduce you to today's sponsor, CookUnity. If you've been following the channel for some time, you probably know I love a good meal delivery service. In particular, I love the convenience of a fully cooked meal delivered ready to eat, so I couldn't not tell you about CookUnity, which partners with award-winning chefs from across the US and delivers delicious, fully cooked meals right to your doorstep. These meals use fresh, seasonal produce and whole foods prepared by over 50 chefs from some of the best restaurants across the country. CookUnity chefs also offer a wide range of meals with over 7 different dietary preferences, including vegan, paleo, and gluten-free options. The meals are also delivered fully cooked, so all you have to do is heat them up. That means dinner is done in as little as 5 minutes with no more cleanup and meal planning. And ordering these meals is easy and effortless. You choose a subscription plan, which you can cancel at any time, and then select from hundreds of meals each week, also prepared by award-winning chefs. And if you can't or don't have time, CookUnity is even happy to select meals for you based on your taste preferences. Like, for example, check out these meals prepared by these incredible New York chefs. First are these red wine braised short ribs with carrot puree prepared by Chef Marc Forgione. There's also this Moroccan chickpea tagine from Chef Lina Alcosi. And finally, check out this shrimp and chorizo paella prepared by Chef Jose Garces. So, if you want to enjoy restaurant quality meals for a fraction of the price, subscriptions start as low as $11 a meal. And right now, you can check out CookUnity by going to cookunity.com/scary50 or click the link in the description and use code SCARY50 to get 50% off your first order of CookUnity meals to try them out for yourself. Beginning in late 1885, a popular children's publication at the time called St. Nicholas Magazine began publishing installments of a story series that ran for almost a year. In it, a young boy named Cedric and his mother carry on with life after the death of Cedric's father. The mother and son also lived in what was called genteel poverty, which is a term used to describe those who were once wealthy but had fallen on tough times. In the story, one day, Cedric learns that he's the heir to an English earldom, so he and his mother relocate to England so that he could be trained to one day take his rightful place in the nobility. And afterwards, Cedric quickly discovers that his grandfather, who was the earl at the time, wasn't a very good person. On the other hand, because of Cedric's modest circumstances after his father died, he brought a vastly different perspective to his grandfather's life, and over the course of his training, Cedric teaches him what it truly means to be a nobleman. It's a classic rags to riches story with a moral that underscores the importance of being a kind, compassionate person, no matter your place in society. The series would end up being such a hit that the author turned it into a novel entitled Little Lord Fauntleroy, which became Cedric's new name when he inherited the earldom. Despite the story's uplifting lesson, however, it's a title that would gain a much darker reputation less than 30 years after its release. On February 6, 1921, Mike Coker was wrapping up a long, grueling day at the O'Laughlin Quarry in Waukesha, Wisconsin. Mike was a pumpman, which was an important job because water is a crucial ingredient in every process of quarry work, and he was eager to finish up and head home. The south end of the quarry had long since been abandoned, so when he saw a woman in a red sweater walking around that area, it immediately got his attention. As he made his way toward the south end, the woman spotted Mike and started heading toward him as well. When they met, Mike could see that she was crying, and then she asked him if he had seen a little boy in the quarry anywhere. Mike almost needed a moment to process the question because it was such an odd thing to be asked in that setting. Mike replied that he hadn't seen a child on quarry property and assured her that if a kid was in the premises, it would have been noticed immediately. She then simply thanked him and turned to walk in the direction of a car that was parked near the south pit. As he watched her walk away, he noticed a man near the car who was looking over the edge of the pit into the pond below. Then when she reached the car, the two got in and drove off. Mike then also finished what he was doing and headed home with a strange story to share with his coworkers the next day. A little more than a month later, on March 8th, another quarry employee was in the south end when he spotted something floating just beneath the surface of the pond. He couldn't immediately tell what it was, but something told him to walk closer to the ledge of the pit to get a better look. Peering down into the still waters, he focused in on an object and suddenly realized what it was. Dozens of feet below the pit ledge was a small, lifeless body. The employee then ran off to the nearest phone to call police, and within the hour, county and state officials were on the site to retrieve the body at what quickly became a somber scene. When the body was pulled out of the water, police laid it face up so an initial examination could take place. The coroner looked the body over and determined it to be a boy of between 5 and 7. Because Wisconsin was dealing with the bitter end of a winter, it was unclear how long the body had been in the water, but the cold had kept it well preserved. Estimates of how long ago the boy might have died ranged from a couple of days to as many as 6 months. As for his appearance, he had a round face with a light complexion and somewhat long blonde curly hair. His clothing also indicated that he came from a well-to-do family that took care of him because he wore a nice blouse with a large collar under a velveteen suit with black stockings and patent leather shoes. After this discovery and after word spread around the quarry on the day the boy was discovered, Mike came forward to tell investigators about his encounter with the woman in the red sweater the month before. Based on this, police came up with an initial theory. Certain areas in the quarry felt far removed from civilization, namely the abandoned southern portion, so couples viewed the area as a lover's lane of sorts and had to be chased off the property periodically. Knowing this, police initially believed that the couple came to the quarry and told their son to wander around for a bit while they remained in the car. While the boy walked around the quarry, investigators thought that he might have gotten too close to the edge of the pit and fallen in, which resulted in his drowning. However, there was a problem. When the boy was examined a little further, the medical examiner found very little water in his lungs, not nearly enough to drown him. Instead, his head showed signs of being hit by a blunt object. Suddenly, the entire course of the investigation changed, and it seemed that the police had a murder investigation on their hands, but they still didn't even know who the boy was. A sketch was then drawn up and run in newspapers, and police expected to learn the boy's name shortly after it was put in front of the public. As expected, a man in Chicago reached out to Waukesha police because his sister's ex-husband frequently threatened the couple's boys. However, it was quickly determined that both of them were alive, and then, much to the surprise of investigators, no other leads came in. So, to find out who the boy was, they resorted to extreme measures. Police came up with an idea that would ensure the boy was seen by as many people as possible. At a local funeral home that doubled as a furniture store, the boy's body was put on display, and the public was invited to come by to view him in hopes that someone would recognize him. Hundreds turned up over the course of 6 weeks, and the body even spent some time on display in nearby Milwaukee, but police soon realized that the majority of those who came to see the boy did so for the novelty of it. After all, it's not often police put a murder victim's body on display, and people didn't want to miss the rare opportunity. At the very least, this did give the boy an identity, although it wasn't exactly what police were after. When people saw the boy's round features, curly blonde hair, and high-quality clothing, they were immediately reminded of a character in a children's book. From that point on, the boy in Waukesha became known as Little Lord Fauntleroy. Afterward, other potential witnesses came forward, but very little of the information they provided was helpful. An owner of a local department store even told investigators that he remembered selling the boy's undergarments and shoes in January, indicating that Little Lord Fauntleroy was a local. The clerk told police that the clothes were not part of his display inventory and that they needed to be ordered, but unfortunately, when asked to provide sales records that might bear the name of whoever paid for the clothing, none could be located. Even more unfortunately, the story of Waukesha's Little Lord Fauntleroy went nowhere despite the publicity it received, and eventually the lead stopped coming in. For more than 25 years, the case was dormant until the disappearance of a woman put police on an all-new trail. On June 15, 1948, Cecilia LeMay was reported missing, and in the search for her, police decided to check the pond in the south section of the O'Loughlin Quarry, the very same one Little Lord Fauntleroy was found dead in. On October 8th, police divers dragged them out of the pit and even set off dynamite at the surface in hopes that it would bring her body to the surface of the water, but nothing was ever found. Now, when police decided to search the pond for her, it wasn't because of a tip that came in or evidence that suggested Cecilia's body would be found there. To them, it was just a good place to hide the body, so it was worth checking out. Unknowingly, however, they had just stumbled on a possible connection between Cecilia and the unknown boy found there in 1921. That connection was Edmund LeMay, Cecilia's husband. In questioning him about his wife's disappearance, Edmund mentioned that he had a son named Homer who was 6 years old in 1921. Edmund had a first wife named Hazel, who was Homer's birth mother, and for reasons that are unclear, Edmund said he allowed a Chicago couple he was acquainted with to adopt Homer that same year. Known only as Mr. and Mrs. James Norton, the couple eventually relocated to Argentina in South America and brought Homer with them, according to Edmund. Not long after they arrived in Argentina, Edmund said he received news that Homer was killed in a car accident and claimed that the Nortons sent him a clipping about it from an English-language newspaper in the country. This was a bit of an odd story police found difficult to believe, and it didn't take long for detectives to start chipping away at it. They first looked into adoption records and found nothing related to Homer or the Nortons. Neither the Nortons nor Homer had passports either. The Milwaukee Police Department then sent a detective to Argentina to look into Edmund's claims, but there was absolutely no record of the supposed accident that claimed Homer's life. No police report, no newspaper article. When Edmund was also asked for the article clipping he said the Nortons sent him, he also failed to produce it. Also, if you're wondering why Homer wasn't placed in Hazel's custody if Edmund didn't want to raise Homer, it's because she died in 1919. So next, police looked into Hazel's death to determine if she might have been a victim of foul play as well. However, they found that Hazel developed tuberculosis, which is a condition that ravages the lungs in 1916 when the couple lived in Milwaukee. She fought the disease for 3 years before it took her life, and there were plenty of records to prove it, so in the end, it was just an unfortunate coincidence. One of the first things police secured from Edmund was a photograph of Homer. In comparing it to an image that was made of the boy after he was found dead in the quarry pond, police were almost certain that the case was about to break wide open. And the resemblance was uncanny, but investigators were so close to the case that they were afraid that they might be biased. A call was then put out to anyone who had come to see the boy when it was on display to contact police, and when they had a large enough group, detectives showed them the image of Homer. Every single one of them agreed that there was a striking resemblance between the two boys. This, however, wasn't enough to positively identify little Lord Fauntleroy as Homer, so police stopped short of declaring that Homer and the boy were one and the same. In the years after Cecilia's disappearance, Edmund couldn't seem to keep himself out of the public eye. At one point, he sued the police after he claimed they used some kind of acid that damaged his bathtub when his home was searched. Not long after, he was arrested and charged with forgery when he tried to cash $67 worth of checks in his wife's name, but he was eventually acquitted of the charge. And in the years that followed, the search for Cecilia went nowhere. Edmund maintained that she just up and left on June 15, 1948, and that she was still alive somewhere, yet a countrywide search for her turned up nothing but a few unconfirmed sightings. No trace of her has ever been found, and Edmund was never charged in connection with her disappearance. No sign of Homer has ever turned up either, and it has never been proven that he is little Lord Fauntleroy. As for the boy found in the quarry, while his body was on display, a woman named Minnie Conrad came to pay her respects. She immediately felt connected to him once she laid eyes on him, and when she asked police what was going to happen with him, they told her that he would eventually be buried by the county. What this meant was that he would basically be wrapped in a blanket and placed in the ground, a type of burial known as a pauper's grave. To Minnie, the boy deserved far better than the fate he suffered, so she began to take up collection to give him a proper burial. She went door to door through Waukesha and solicited donations from the rich and poor alike. Eventually, more than $170 was raised, an equivalent of nearly $3,000 in 2024, which was more than enough to pay for a nice funeral, burial plot, and headstone. But, contrary to the buzz around the body being on display, the boy's funeral drew little interest from the general public. Only a handful of people showed up for the cemetery, and most of them were detectives working the case. After he was laid to rest, Minnie visited the grave with flowers every year on the anniversary of the boy being discovered. Interestingly, there were supposedly several sightings at Homer's gravesite of a woman who visited every so often dressed in all black. According to witnesses, the woman was not Minnie, but attempts by the police to identify and question this woman were unsuccessful. To this day, the identity of little Lord Fauntleroy is unknown, and he lies in a Wisconsin cemetery under a headstone that reads, "Unknown boy found in O'Laughlin Quarry." On the night of May 27, 1980, 32-year-old Dorothy Scott sat in an employee meeting at work trying to keep herself from being so distracted. Her place of employment was a 2-in-1 shop in Anaheim, California that catered to a clientele that enjoyed partaking in illicit substances. On one side was Swinger's Psych Shop, which sold things like lava lamps and beaded door curtains, and on the other was Custom John's Head Shop, where customers could get paraphernalia related to tobacco and cannabis consumption. Interestingly, what the shop sold was in complete contrast to Dorothy's personality. She was a devout Christian who never touched alcohol or drugs. She preferred to keep a low profile, yet she loved her work, namely because she grew up in that setting. Her father Jacob was actually the founder and original owner of the shops, but he had since sold them off. However, when the sale was complete, Dorothy decided to remain on board as the shop's bookkeeper. At the meeting that night, Dorothy found herself drawn to her coworker Conrad. This wasn't a romantic attraction or anything like that. Conrad just didn't look like his usual self. He looked fatigued and ill, which automatically concerned Dorothy. Those close to her knew that her purpose in life was to help and care for others, and while the employee meeting was certainly important, her concern for Conrad's well-being superseded anything else that was going on. In looking him over, she couldn't help but notice a large, raised bump on Conrad's arm. It looked red and swollen, and as soon as the meeting concluded, she approached him and asked what was wrong. He told her that he wasn't feeling terribly well, and she replied that it might have something to do with the spot on his arm, so she offered to take him to the hospital. Seeing how concerned Dorothy was, Conrad agreed that it was a good idea to at least get it checked out. One of their co-workers, 18-year-old Pam, also overheard the conversation and offered to go to the hospital with them. Conrad and Pam then hopped into Dorothy's white 1973 Toyota station wagon while she buckled in her 4-year-old son, Sean. Dorothy was also a single mother, and sensing that this was about to be a late night, she decided to stop at her parents' house to drop Sean off while she took Conrad to the UC Irving Medical Center. A little while later, her father Jacob and her mother Vera were pleasantly surprised to see their daughter and grandson and more than happy to take care of him while Dorothy helped out her sick coworker. Just before she walked out the door, Vera suggested that Dorothy swap out her thinner black scarf for a warmer red one since temperatures were already dipping into the high 50s. After wrapping the new scarf around her neck, Dorothy promised she'd be back to pick up Sean as soon as possible and disappeared out the door. At the hospital, Dorothy and Pam kept themselves occupied by thumbing through magazines and watching TV while Conrad was being checked out. They arrived there a little after 9 p.m. and by 11 o'clock, Conrad was being discharged after being diagnosed with a black widow spider bite. Luckily for Conrad, Dorothy noticing his condition that night likely saved him a whole lot of agony because all he was given was a prescription and told to head home and get some rest. Because he still wasn't feeling great, Dorothy decided that she'd pull her car up to the emergency department door so Conrad wouldn't have to walk all the way out into the parking lot. While she did that, Pam and Conrad stopped at the hospital pharmacy to get his prescription filled, and with a bottle of pills in his hand, the pair went outside expecting to see Dorothy waiting there for them. Weirdly, there was no white Toyota station wagon pulled up to the curb though, and there wasn't any sign of her in the parking lot. The stop at the pharmacy would have given Dorothy more than enough time to get to the car, so Pam and Conrad decided to walk toward the parking lot to look for her. Just as they were about to reach the parking area, they spotted a car that looked very much like Dorothy's speeding right at them. They couldn't tell who was driving it, but the car's movements were erratic and it was definitely not like Dorothy to drive so recklessly. Pam and Conrad even jumped out of the way and waved their arms at the driver, but the car never stopped. Instead, it went right past them to the hospital exit, ran a stop sign, and sped down the road. Pam and Conrad were almost frozen for a moment as they processed what just happened. They had no idea what had gotten into Dorothy, but when the car didn't return to the hospital, Pam called Dorothy's parents to see if she'd return home. Jacob answered and was immediately concerned because Dorothy wasn't there and he knew that she'd never leave people stranded at the hospital or anywhere else for that matter. All this was too much for Pam to just sit around and guess what might have happened, so she immediately called police. As she talks to a dispatcher though, she got the feeling that they weren't taking her very seriously, but an officer did show up to take a report. After talking with Pam and Conrad, however, the officer didn't believe there was any reason to suspect that Dorothy was in any kind of trouble, and that's where he left things. So Pam and Conrad were kind of dumbfounded. Why would Dorothy offer to take Conrad to the hospital and then sit around and wait for him to be finished in the emergency room and then just take off when the three were about to leave anyway? Nothing about the officer's assessment made sense. This became even more clear when around 4:30 the next morning, someone called 911 to report a car on fire in an alleyway about 10 miles from the medical center. When emergency services arrived, they found what appeared to be a white car with its driver's side door open and headlights still on. It was Dorothy's car, but she was nowhere to be found. Police now had no choice but to investigate, and it didn't take a lot of poking around to find out about some interesting developments leading up to her disappearance. In talking to Jacob and Vera, police learned that Dorothy may have had a stalker. Starting October of the previous year, she received a barrage of phone calls both at work and at her aunt's home where she and Sean lived. The voice on the other end always sounded so familiar to Dorothy, but the caller disguised it just enough to keep her from being able to place where she knew it from. Whenever the phone would ring with the stalker on the other end, the tone of his voice and the things he'd say could be menacing one day and kind of sweet the next. Like for example, during one call, the stalker told Dorothy that he had left her a present and she should go outside to retrieve it. When she looked outside her window, she saw a single dead rose lying on the hood of her car. In contrast, on another call, he promised that he'd chop her into bits and no one would ever find her. He also seemed to know things that very few people in her life knew, which was beyond creepy. Basically, on and off for months, the caller terrorized her and she quickly started to fear for her life. At one point, she contemplated getting a gun, and a week before she vanished, she even started taking karate lessons to learn how to defend herself. One of the more chilling aspects of Dorothy's disappearance began with how police and the family ultimately decided to handle the case in the early goings. For the first 2 weeks after she went missing, those close to the case kept it quiet. This is because if the stalker started calling Jacob and Vera's house now instead, they could be certain it was the man responsible for all the calls Dorothy received, and that is exactly what happened. Vera was usually the one who picked up. One time, he tauntingly asked her if she was related to Dorothy. Another time, Vera answered and the stalker simply said, "I've got her," and then hung up. Police tried to trace the calls, but the caller never stayed on the phone long enough to determine where they were originating from. So finally, after 2 weeks of torment and no leads and no sign of Dorothy, Jacob went to the local newspaper. On June 11th, the very first story about Dorothy's disappearance ran. Hours after it hit stands, the phone rang at the desk of the paper's managing editor. When he answered, he heard a strange male voice telling him how Dorothy was the love of his life and that she cheated on him, so he had to kill her. Now, with the news out, it sadly wouldn't have been out of the ordinary for hoaxes to crop up, but when the caller started sharing information that only those who were with her that night would know, detectives believed the editor really did speak to the person responsible for her disappearance. The caller told him that Dorothy was at the hospital with a coworker who had been bitten by a spider and that she had changed into a red scarf that night. These bits of information were almost shared as if they were to prove his validity, and it worked because neither of those facts were included in the story that appeared in the newspaper. What's even creepier is that the scarf change occurred just 2 hours before her disappearance, and Conrad's diagnosis came just moments before her car went speeding out the parking lot. How could the caller know these things if he wasn't following them or had Dorothy hostage somewhere? When the editor asked about this, the caller told him that Dorothy made a phone call to him from the medical center to let him know where she was and what was going on. Pam, however, insisted that there were only 2 times Dorothy left her side at the hospital. The first was to use the washroom while they waited for Conrad, and Pam was certain she wasn't gone long enough to make a phone call. And the second was when Dorothy went to the parking lot to get her car. The editor would also tell police that the caller sounded southern to him, but strangely, that's not at all how Vera described the voice in the phone calls on her home telephone. She'd have plenty of opportunities to hear it too, because the stalker continued to call Jacob and Vera's house for 4 years. And each time, he'd either say he killed Dorothy or that he was holding her hostage. After some time had passed since her initial disappearance, the calls weren't as frequent as they once were, but Vera noticed that this person called on Wednesday afternoons more often than not. She was often home alone then, so she was the person who usually answered. Then, on one Wednesday in April 1984, Jacob was home when the phone rang. When he picked up and said hello, he only heard the click of a phone being hung up. After that, the call suddenly stopped and Dorothy's case went cold. 4 months later, a construction foreman with a telephone company was leading the installation of some lines on a hillside when he came across the charred remains of a human skull and several other bones that also appeared to be human. And when checked against Dorothy's dental records, the skull was confirmed to be hers. Once these were examined, strangely, it was believed that Dorothy was burned long after she died. On top of that, her remains were only slightly burned, which also indicated to police that she didn't die in the fire set in her car a few hours after she disappeared. And in fact, on the land where the telephone lines were being installed, there had been an out-of-control brush fire in 1982, and the medical examiner confirmed that the state of her remains was consistent with that type of fire, meaning that she had been dead for at least 2 years. Even more strangely, a watch found at the scene was also confirmed by Vera to belong to Dorothy. It had come to a stop at 12:30 a.m. on March 29, 1980, about an hour after she vanished. Then, horrifyingly, soon after her remains were found, the calls to Jacob and Vera started again. This time, the caller always mockingly asked if Dorothy was home. Now, considering that the caller knew about the red scarf and Conrad's diagnosis, police had an unusually small suspect pool to work with. It had to be someone close to Dorothy, both in relationship and proximity, and police started by looking into Dennis Terry, her ex-husband and Sean's father. Just before she disappeared, Dennis had wrapped up a visit with Dorothy and Sean, and during his stay, the former couple had a heated argument. According to those Dorothy told about the argument, Dennis wanted custody of Sean, and according to those who knew her, there was no way Dorothy was just going to let that happen, so police wondered if Dennis killed her to secure custody of their son. At the time of her disappearance, however, Dennis was on a 2-day bus trip home to Missouri. He not only had receipts from the trip, but there were several other passengers who confirmed that he was on the bus the entire time. With that, he was quickly ruled out as a suspect. Next, there was a man who worked at an auto body shop across the street from where Dorothy's workplace was, who she had become acquainted with, but that was the extent of their relationship. Given this, police found it strange that the man told them that he wanted to marry her one day. As far as anyone could tell, he and Dorothy were not romantically involved at all. People who knew and worked with him also told police that he was mentally and emotionally unstable, but police were eventually led to the conclusion that he wasn't involved. Maybe the most interesting lead discovered by police was the connection they discovered between the shops Dorothy worked at and where her remains were discovered. The land belonged to the man who purchased the 2 shops from Jacob and Dorothy's boss. He also actually led the meeting that night and would have known about her taking Conrad to the hospital with Pam. If he approached her in the parking lot, it's possible that the conversation started friendly and that Dorothy mentioned Conrad's diagnosis to him. However, it wasn't until years later that a possible motive was discovered. This man was indicted for tax evasion, and since Dorothy was the shop's bookkeeper, he could have instructed her to alter the books, or she could have found out that he was doing it himself. In either case, it was plausible that he felt the need to get rid of her to protect himself. On top of that, he was someone that Jacob knew well and talked to often. Vera, however, was not, so he may have felt more comfortable exposing his voice to her on the phone calls. Then, when Jacob picked up the phone that one time 4 years after Dorothy's disappearance, it could have spooked him, and that's when the phone calls ended. Tragically, as of 2024, Dorothy's murder remains a complete mystery. Jacob and Vera have long since passed away, but Sean, now an adult, continues to seek justice for his mother. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.